Welcome to this question time at the Wheeler Centre. This is a series we do every month and we always discuss really interesting topics. I'm Madeleine Morris. I work for the ABC here in Melbourne. I'm a reporter for them. And I've been very privileged to be the host of this series of events, which is a full hour of Q&A with this excellent panel that we've got assembled here for this evening. And you all know what we're talking about tonight. We're talking about population, which as we hit 7 billion people on Earth has become one of the most important issues to deal with, but also one of the most awkward issues because it touches on so many difficult questions. Some of the questions we might think about tonight are, does population matter? Why does it matter? The difference between population policy and immigration policy. Is there a limit to the number of immigrants that any particular country can absorb? Or should we just have open borders? These are some of the things we might talk about tonight. And one of the big questions, does Australia actually have a population policy at this point in time? So we have a fantastic panel assembled with some really different skills and different areas of expertise here tonight. So let me introduce them to you. First of all, I'll start with Ian, Professor Ian Lowe, who was president of the Australian Conservation Foundation for 10 years. He's Emeritus Professor of Science, Technology and Society at Griffith Uni in Brisbane. He's also been a referee for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and his most recent book is Bigger or Better? Australia's Population Debate. Next to him is Lenore Manderson. She is a medical anthropologist, social historian and public health researcher and educator. She teaches at both Brown University in the United States and the University of Witwatersrand, I always have difficulty with that one, in South Africa. And she also lives here, so splits her time equally, well, not quite so equally, but splits her time between South Africa, the US and Melbourne. So it's great to have her here tonight, that she just happens to be on our turf for this evening. Professor Michael Buxton teaches at RMIT. He formerly headed the intergovernmental process for Australia's national greenhouse strategy, and he's a specialist in urbanisation and the growing urbanisation that we face not only in Australia but also around the world. And then Louise Searle is director at the Humanitarian Advisory Group, which is a Melbourne-based social enterprise. Her humanitarian experience focuses on the protection of people affected by conflict, displacement and disaster, and she's worked all over the world in those sorts of fields. And just because she's showing off, she's also a registered nurse, because as if that wasn't enough, she just had to add one more little degree in there. So her specialisation is health disasters, and the effect that can have on population. So quite a diverse panel here tonight. And I want to kick it off by asking you all a question of my own. Ian, I'll ask you the biggest question, the thorniest question. Is there a maximum number that we can actually absorb here on Earth and in Australia?
The wise American H.L. Mencken said, every complex question always has a simple answer and it's always wrong. That is a complex question and it doesn't have a simple answer, because natural systems don't notice just how many of us are. It notices what impact we have on them, and different people have different impacts. Andrew Forrest or Gina Reinhardt have much more environmental impact than Ian Lowe. Ian Lowe has much more environmental impact than a peasant in Bangladesh. What we can say is that both within Australia and globally, the sum total of the resource demands and impacts of the human population is greater than natural systems can sustainably absorb. So in that sense, we are overpopulated now. And if we want to get back in balance without doing anything drastic to the population, we need to be reducing our resource demands per person. Now the problem with that, of course, is that wherever you look in the world, whether it's the poorest country or a very rich society like Australia, every government thinks growing the economy and consuming more resources is the highest priority. So we have a fundamental problem that we're already in overshoot, but most governments are still in denial about the problem and seemingly determined to overshoot still further. And we know if you look at natural ecological systems, the inevitable consequence of populations exceeding what can be sustainably carried, is that the population declines rapidly. And I've been arguing that we should have a policy of stabilising the population, because if the population isn't stabilised by measures that are socially acceptable, it will be reduced by starvation, disease and fighting amongst ourselves.
Okay, well,
and most of us would want a better future than that for our children.
Maybe we can get into some of those measures a little bit later on. Lenore, is it a consequence, a natural consequence of our improved health and medicine that we are simply going to have to deal with overpopulation?
Yes, well, health and medicine's not natural, so it's already an intervention, isn't it? And if you look at the world's population, which is where you've begun, over the last 2,000 years, there has been an increasing population at a relatively consistent rate from, say, 1000 AD or before then. So it's not a recent trend, despite a conventional wisdom, which is that with increased medical research, with increased interventions, with increased public health interventions, we have had massive changes. So it's also about how people have used resources to support health, and then a few key interventions, such as, for example, smallpox vaccinations, public health, potable water and potable sanitation. I think the dilemma now, though, is to what end we're using health and how we're directing it, so that the countries, for the most part, that have the highest population growth rate today are benefiting from interventions to reduce the death rate, and are still having large numbers of children, whereas societies where that's stabilised do not have that trend. So really, I mean, much of the global population growth between now and, say, 2040 is projected to be in Africa, and it's by far the poorest countries of Africa. And I think, and we know that these are not the countries with sophisticated transplant programs and other kinds of interventions. These are countries where basic health is still not being delivered to the population. We correct that, we're already intervening in a palpable way.
Okay. Lots of questions there that raises, and I think that I'll be very interested to get into a few more of those as well. So, but Michael, I suppose what everyone is saying round and about, I mean, all of the issues are all very interconnected on population, but the key to this question is, well, one of the keys is not just how many we are, the blanket number, but also where we live, and that's changing rapidly.
Well, most of the increase in population is occurring in urbanised areas, in cities, and most of that, about 90% of that increase in developing countries. So we're finding at the moment a monumental urbanising trend that is only going to increase with about 70% of people living in cities. It's over 50% now, and this is unprecedented for the world. And what it means for the world is really the big population issue, I think, because other than the depletion of natural resources, because as this world population in cities increases, so does individual consumption, per capita consumption goes up. So urbanisation has huge implications for natural resources.
So a city dweller has a bigger footprint on the environment.
Has a bigger footprint, and the big issue for Australia is that Sydney and Melbourne are going to double their population if our current rates of immigration stay up and trends continue. To 2050, Melbourne will move to a city of 8 million people from 4 million, and that means it's going to tip over into a completely new state. It'll be a completely different city, because all these elements that kind of just work at the moment are not going to work unless we fundamentally change their relationship and do all sorts of things to make that work. And that's a monumental challenge that governments in Australia are just not facing up to, illustrated by Tony Abbott refusing to fund public transport and actually taking money back from a road project because the government won't put it to, he won't let the government in Victoria put it to public transport. I mean, that illustrates the ignorance.
Louise, with a more international outlook, which is what your expertise is in, I mean, we see on the news every night unfolding humanitarian disasters. I mean, Syria for the last 4 years has been the worst one, and the huge tide of refugees currently or migrants, if you want to call them, coming from Africa to Europe at the moment at great cost themselves. Do we have any right to restrict flows of desperate people to cross borders? Do countries matter when it comes to lives and letting people live?
Well, I think that's a great question, and
You
you mentioned Syria, and we know that half the population of that country is now outside that country, and of course the burden of looking after those people is with Lebanon and Jordan, and even Iraq to some extent. Everyone has the right to seek asylum. That's in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and I think when we come to our part of the world. I think we have to keep in mind that we have such a tiny little trickle of people coming here trying to seek asylum that even if, it's just it's a tiny proportion of the global problem.
But we're not even talking about asylum. I mean, we're talking about economic migration and the very issue that Michael was talking about just then about our expanding cities, which at this point in time we're just not dealing with. So, I mean, do we need to say, well, actually, despite your terrible situation, no.
Well, I think the Refugee Convention was set up for a particular purpose, and that was to protect people who couldn't be protected from their own state and who had crossed a border. What we see are mixed migration flows, so people, like you say, with economic motivation. But we have a robust legal mechanism to determine who is actually at risk of persecution. I think the problem with the current, one of many problems with the current policies is that it's just trying to kind of, the Stop the Boats policy is just sort of pushing the problem back into Asia, back globally, and at the same time, the government's cutting development aid, which is trying to address poverty and some of those factors that are motivating people to move. The other thing I would say is that vulnerability and mobility are kind of inversely correlated, so that very often the people who are the most vulnerable and the most in need, those most exposed to risk, are the ones that actually don't have the ability to move. And I think just following on around the urbanisation, population density in terms of natural disasters, we tend to have a very simplistic perspective. So the number of deaths, that's how bad the disaster is. So if you look at the Indian Ocean tsunami from 2004, anywhere from 220,000 up to 300,000 plus deaths and around 2.2 million people displaced across 12 countries. Fast forward to April 25 and the Kathmandu Valley earthquake. It's now with the second one up to around 8,000 deaths, but 2.2 to 2.8 million people displaced. So we are seeing that, you can have a huge amount of displacement and ongoing costs, and when large numbers of people are affected. And all throughout Asia, we have long coastlines. So we have more people, we have more infrastructure, we have more economic activity, more livelihoods concentrated in those areas. And consequently, the results of those disasters can be quite dramatic. And I think, one of the challenges is I was reading a report this week that was suggesting for every US $1,000 spent on emergency response in this region, only $237 is spent on disaster risk reduction and disaster risk management.
'Twas ever thus, though, right?
Sorry?
It 'twas ever thus.
And I don't think the answer is to then pull it from emergency response. Just today, the latest updates from Nepal, the UN Appeal Flash Fund request for funding is 10% funded. So it's not that we're overfunding emergency response and not doing it, it's that we need to, instead of attaching it to disaster risk reduction to humanitarian work, we need to be integrating it into longer-term sustainable development, because we know...
And what do you mean by disaster risk reduction? If we're talking then about, the coastal population of Asia, for example, what sort of things are you talking about there?
Part of it's,
and whose responsibility is that?
Well, I think I think ultimately governments are responsible for it, but we know that we have many poor governments in the region that do need assistance. But it's about emergency preparedness, but it's also about, and some of my colleagues on the panel can probably talk to this even better, but it's actually about sustainable development and making sure that we are, developing in a sustainable way that's not going to then make us at risk of disaster.
Thanks. I'm wondering if there are any big cities that work. I've actually got about 1 million questions, but anyway.
Well, you're the first to put your hand up. So let's start with 2, and if no one else puts their hand up, then we'll come back to you.
Cool. Are there any big cities that work, and how have some of the really big cities in the world made the transition? Because obviously there was a time when they were much smaller So, you know, cities like London or, I mean, you know, numerous cities, but how have they made the transition? It's a bit mind-boggling to think of Melbourne doubling its population in the next 30 years or so. So, yeah.
Those are great questions. I think probably we should start with you on that one, Michael.
Well, I think we tend to be mesmerised at the moment by the mega city complex. We hear all the time about how vast Asian cities are and how small our city is. And we're comparing a city like Melbourne, which, by the way, used to be the second biggest city in the British Empire in the late 19th century. So it was a big city in world terms. We're comparing a city of 4 million with, say, Mexico City of 24 million or Shanghai of 24 million, the whole population of Australia. Now, we look at those cities, just to try to answer that question succinctly. We look at, say, some of those cities, and they're doing a lot to try to make them work. And the first thing that they've done is that they occupy a relatively small area of land compared to their population, in comparison to Melbourne, which occupies a vast area of land in comparison to their population.
These are cities in Asia you're talking about specifically?
These are, say, Shanghai and Mexico City, lots of cities like that. They're very compact comparative to Melbourne, and they put huge amounts of money into public transport. So you look at, you know, the public transport systems that the Chinese government have put in those cities, and intercity transport is helping make them work. So their compactness and their systems, they've had to retrofit them because China is basically rebuilding the densest cities in the world anyway, outside perhaps some of the Middle Eastern cities. They're probably no denser than the original cities, but they're trying to make them work. And if you fast forward to, or run across a continent to, say, Europe, by the time Melbourne gets to 8 million, there will only be, if European cities don't increase dramatically, there'll only be a couple of European cities bigger than Melbourne. Right? We tend to forget that most European cities are much less than 8 million. So we will be one of the developed countries' largest cities, and even the United States has a vast number of medium-sized to small cities. It has its mega regions too. So cities like London, Berlin's a bit over 3 million people. London, Paris are the two big European cities, and they tend to work because of the same reasons the Chinese and the Japanese cities are another classic case. Larger Tokyo, from Tokyo, Yokohama, 35 million people in a vast urban area, and it works.
But do they work because they have multiple city centres, so people tend to be not coming all into the city, such as we are for the most part in Melbourne? Well, for a large part.
Lots of these cities have different city forms, and it's very difficult to compare city with city because some are monocentric, some are polycentric, and are multiple cities centres. But I mean, one of the reasons Japanese cities, vast areas like that, work is because of brilliant public transport and compact mixed-use extended urban areas are based around public transport. So the rail stations in a place like Tokyo are the new cathedrals, right? They're where people gather. So they work for all those reasons, and the same reason that Paris and London still work. But they're at the point now where they're having to put vast new expenditures into redoing their public transport. They work because of wonderful public transport and compact cities and mixed-use centres. So they're the lessons we need to we need to learn.
Yeah. Can I just follow on from that?
Just bring the mic a little closer to you, I think.
Yeah,
Lenore.
sure.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the things, I think the key word's about compactness, but it's also around imagination of what the space might be like. If much of the discussion around population is global, if we put the entire world's population together now, we would have space in the state of Colorado if everybody lived at the density of Manhattan.
What?
True, which means like New South
We'd
Wales.
all fit in Colorado?
We would all fit in Colorado.
Of the whole world?
The entire world. So we don't. Much of the world doesn't get lived in, but that's a relevant thing to bear in mind. So, and the point is that places like New York are wonderful in many ways. They're exciting because of the density. they also work because of the density. So you can't say, well, we'll just improve public transport without thinking around population density. Otherwise, you always run up against the argument of it not being affordable. But the other thing is the imagination of local government and the imagination of civil society. So that if you go to New York, increasingly there are gardens where there was once deserty space, and that's really the credit for the last 2 mayors. Increasingly, people grow bees, grow their own fruit and vegetables, restaurants run sustainable kitchens, and they do all of those other things, which makes it a really interesting place to look at as we think about other kinds of ways to live.
So you're bringing the country to the urban...
Yeah.
I mean, what is traditionally more a country pursuit of
Indeed,
farming?
but also really strong commitment to addressing the problems at present about population and sustainability as twin problems, while thinking through at what point will these populations begin to cap, and how do we slow them? Because the other thing that is dramatic, not only about places like the US, but absolutely about Johannesburg, which is much more spread out, is the absolute pervasiveness of solar panels for everything. And Australia kicked off 40 years ago embracing a whole pile of policies around environmental sustainability and environmental protection, and we have consistently watched those being eaten away. And indeed, even this whole discussion, because it was limits to growth and overpopulation discussions and so on, were all conversations we were having late 60s, early 70s. And then it was like we got collective amnesia.
Why did we get collective amnesia about that? Does anyone know?
Well, I think the catastrophic event was the takeover of the economics profession, to use the word profession rather loosely, by the so-called Chicago School, which is not just pre-Keynesian, but arguably more primitive than the economic thinking of Adam Smith, who recognised that there are limitations on the market and that the invisible hand needs to be guided. And so governments in the English-speaking world in particular vacated the whole notion of planning in favour of this dotty delusion that everything will be right if only we leave it to the market.
But, I mean, I think... I was not very old in the 70s, so I don't remember that the first time that it came around, but I certainly remember the discussions about it, or have read discussions about it, where population was this big concern. But now it's not only down to the market, is it, but it's also down to the taboo nature, I think, from a social policy point of view, of discussing population control, because that means two things: either stopping immigration or stopping people from having babies. And neither of those things we can actually talk about in a mature way, can we?
But we did 40 years ago, when you were in kindy and the rest of us were, three of the four of us were already well into our careers. We talked all of the time, including around how to circumvent country policies where women did not have access to contraception, which is why, in fact, the growth rates in Latin America are really relatively low now. So it's not about particular religions necessarily, it's about the links across them. We tied these issues all to things like women's rights, racism, environmental degradation and everything else. And I agree with Ian. I mean, I think that neoliberalism has much to answer for. When you combine neoliberalism with governments without imagination, you have a recipe for disaster.
And in terms of population, there's now this almost universal view in Canberra that population growth is good for the economy. A former Prime Minister actually said, in terms of population, the bigger the better. You know, as if there was no such thing as limits. So all of the talk has been about how we can grow the economy. And in those terms, population growth is undoubtedly good, because if there's more people, you sell more food and more clothes and more houses and more people travel on transport. But that doesn't mean that people are better off. And in fact, all of the studies suggest that a rapidly growing population per capita benefits are actually going down, and that's been happening in Australia for the last 20 years.
I'm hearing lots of noises of assent there, so I'm going to ask you guys a question. Who here thinks that there should be limits on population in Australia? That's about half. Who's going to be brave enough to say how we should do that?
Well, I'll be brave enough to say it because
I'll come to you in a second.
the two things that affect how big the population will be in future are the rate of migration and how many children we have. Now, since Australian women have been substantially in control of their fertility, the number of children per adult woman has declined from 4 or 5 when we were young to slightly less than 2. And the only reason there are more births than deaths each year in Australia, about 150,000 more births than deaths, is that the number of women of reproductive age is still growing as a result of the past birth rate and migration. The demographic studies show that as the population ages, the natural increase will taper off. And if we had no migration today, the population would stabilise in about 20 years. At low levels of migration, up to about a net intake of 70,000, the population stabilises later at a higher level. At a level of migration inward above 70,000, the population diverges without limit because those who come in have children of their own who in turn have children of their own. So if we want to stabilise the population, the decision we have to take is to set the migration target with that in mind. Now at the moment, migration isn't about refugees. It's swamped by business migrants and so-called skill migrants. The ludicrous situation that when 6% of Australians are unemployed and about 10% are underemployed, we're bringing in 150,000 people a year to do the work that needs to be done. I think we could say today that we should have a generous refugee program, we should have provision for family reunion, but there's almost no grounds for bringing in migrants to work in Australia when probably 20% of Australians can't get the work they want.
Okay. So that's what you were going to say, were you?
This is going to put the cat amongst the pigeons. I read an article a few years ago, and I can't remember who it was by, that was all about how we have globalisation in everything except people. That everything moves around the world, trade, communication, everything. People are stuck in their nations or wherever they've been born. And this man was suggesting that we should globalise the movement of people. And I'm just interested in, it was mentioned before, I think, by Louise, the notion of not having borders and people just moving at will.
Which is the opposite to what Ian has just said.
Exactly,
should
yeah.
happen. Okay.
And everybody seemed to like that so much about that. That's why I thought it might put the cat amongst the pigeons.
Is there anyone who thinks that is a good idea?
Well, I don't know that it's a good idea, but I think it's worth thinking about. I mean, obviously it would require a lot of changes and a lot of different laws and requirements and so on, but I don't think it's such a stupid idea.
All right, who said very loudly it's a stupid idea? Or many of you who said it's a stupid idea. This lady here, I'm just going to return the tables a little bit because I am very interested to hear. I'm not sure that any of you are going to bite on that. Whether that's
you were?
All right. I'll hear this really quickly from this lady here who says it's a stupid idea with the hat behind you. Yes? And then I'll come to you, Lenore.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, Mary Drost. It is a stupid idea. Look what's happening in Europe. There's no borders, and there's thousands arriving by boat, landing in poor Italy, and just going right across Europe. They're being swamped. It's a terrible situation. And that's how the world would be. How many billion do you want to move here? I mean, it's just mad.
Go ahead, Lenore.
Okay, yeah. I mean, I think it's not about... I mean, to some extent we have the globalisation of populations, and that's why we have globalisation as a phenomenon. There is always migration, and it's been happening much earlier than we invented the term globalisation. I think the key issue, though, is around what price we play on national sovereignty, but also in that context, what we do about portable populations in terms of things like health benefits, insurance, aged care, care for illness and with ageing and so on. And I think that is something that Europe has been grappling with, and there is now an Southeast Asian Union, which is working on the similar principles from the European Union, which recognises that borders are permeable And even if they're not legally permeable, they have long been illegally permeable, and that is one of the problems. So United States, for example, and South Africa both face routinely the fact that there are large numbers of people without papers, and if you're without papers, you have no rights at all.
Mm-hmm. So, but do people who are there first, do they have more right to that particular land just because they were there first? Might ask that of you, Louise. Well, I mean, if that's going to make you uncomfortable to answer, I mean, this lady here is talking about the huge numbers coming from Africa, and saying that they're being swamped in Europe, and it's
the way I would answer
think.
that is that I think that every person is entitled to safety, to be treated with dignity, and to their human rights.
That's a very easy answer to the question, which doesn't deal with it.
Has to be the starting point.
Yeah.
You know, I think this issue of large numbers of unregistered people, and we certainly see it and encounter it, particularly in urban responses, in massive disasters, that, you know, tenants and trying for them to realise their housing, land and property rights is very challenging. So, yeah, I don't think it's an easy issue, but I think that it's too simplistic to say that it's got to stop, and I think you have to turn it on the head and look at what is actually going to protect people who, you know, under international law are deserving of protection in the first place.
Mm-hmm. But should they be getting that protection in the countries where they were?
Well, they flee because they don't. I mean, that's what a refugee is. It's someone who is outside their country of origin and is being persecuted. And the countries that are, you know, this is Pakistan, Iran, it's Jordan, it's Lebanon. It's not countries like Australia, the UK, the US that are bearing the brunt of large numbers of
and
refugees.
The issue is not about anarchy.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, the movement of people may be unorganised in the context that Louise is talking about, but it's not as if a group of refugees are taken into a country and then it is anarchy and someone comes into my house and throws me out on the street because they believe that they ought to. I mean, we're not talking about, surely, the complete removal of all government with a recognition that borders are malleable.
Just to keep on the Africa-Europe point, because I think that is in the news at the moment and everyone is obviously very... I mean, I've lived in London for 12 years. I'm very aware that the fact... I've been to Calais, I've spoken to people who are trying to get on trains to come to the UK, and some of them are have a genuine fear of persecution. Yep. Many of them are just trying to get a better life.
And imagine if we put all the millions of dollars that we're spending in Manus and Nauru into a really efficient, effective system for determining refugee status and for supporting...
But not refugee status, though. I think that's the point. It's not only about refugee status, it's about economic migrants.
But we surely can't object to that. I mean, most of us in this room are the descendants of people who came to Australia for a better life.
Yeah.
And I suspect if there were an Indigenous person on this panel, they'd say that there's been a problem with uncontrolled immigration for about 230 years. That they didn't decide to set quotas for the number of people who could come from Britain. But I think there's a political agenda behind this talk about freeing up borders, because it mostly comes from far-right propaganda organisations. I won't dignify them by calling themselves think tanks because there's not much sign of thinking, who argue that the reason Australian manufacturing is uncompetitive is that we have reasonable wages in Australia. And if we had free movement of labour across borders, then Australians would either have to accept Chinese wages or be out of work. I mean, it's all about trying to reduce wages and conditions for Australian workers. And I think we should resist that. I think it's entirely reasonable for any sovereign nation to decide who... I mean, I can't remember who said it, but it's reasonable for us to decide who will come and on what conditions they will come.
I think that was John Howard, actually, just in case anyone didn't get that, I think quite memorably.
No, I mean, he was using it for a nakedly political point, but a sovereign nation does have a right to determine its destiny.
So borders do matter.
Borders do matter, and I think we have a right to work out what is sustainable for Australia. I think we should also accept that there's no possibility, even in principle, of a country like Australia solving the problems of the economically desperate or the refugees of the Asia-Pacific region. I mean, the annual increase of the population in India is greater than our total population. Mm-hmm. And I think if we're serious about not wanting desperate people to brave shark-infested waters in leaky boats to try to get to Australia, we should try to ensure that people are secure where they are. And for that reason, I think it's borderline criminal to cut our aid budget, which is already among the lowest in the developed world, as the budget last night did. If we're serious about a better life for people, we should be trying to give them a secure life where they are, because not many people want to leave their country. You've got to be pretty desperate.
Just really briefly, and then we'll go to our next question. If we're going to talk about Australia's capacity, though, for migration, I mean, in terms of natural resources, you're arguing that we should limit migration because of, in particular, the unemployment and perhaps the management of our resources. But when it comes to the sheer amount of natural resources which we have, do we have the capacity to support a bigger population?
Well, we have some resources. I mean, we have enough coal to destroy the planetary climate, for example, so we can clearly afford to give some of that away. But we don't have much water, and we don't have much productive land. And the first State of the Environment report in 1996 said that the existing population and the existing consumption is causing serious environmental problems in Australia. Loss of biodiversity, degradation of productive land, the state of our inland rivers, especially the Murray-Darling, the pressures on the coastal zone, spiralling greenhouse gas emissions. And all of those problems are linearly dependent on population.
But could we manage, is it down to the management of those resources or just the actual...
Well, there's no doubt we could manage them better. I mean, a lot of irrigation water in the Murray-Darling Basin still flows through open channels in an arid zone where it's over 40 degrees in the day in summer. Yeah. And there is an advanced technology called the pipe, which the Romans invented, and so it's had a pretty fair field trial that dramatically reduces evaporative losses. So there's no doubt we could do better. But there's also no doubt that there isn't much appetite in governments for doing better, because that requires planning, it requires investment, and it requires having a vision, whereas governments tend to fly by the seat of their pants and worry about this month's trade figures or next month's iron ore price.
Okay, sorry, Michael.
Just one other quick point. I think the question is an interesting one because Europe illustrates a different element to this problem. It's the internal migration across countries in Europe has led to more people moving within Europe than have tried to get into Europe. And so what really, I think what's really interesting about the response to that is with the exception of an unknown number of people in the UK, because there hasn't been a referendum yet, but we'll find out how many people in the UK are concerned enough about that to want to take the UK out of the European Union. But what really interests me about it is that the governments of those countries have actually held firm to the idea of continuing to allow internal migration across borders. So I think that it's a very interesting question. That policy has held up, and vast numbers of people, far more than expected, came from Poland to London, for example, coming from Romania to London. And if you look at Eastern Europe, most of the medium-sized and larger cities in the former East Germany and other parts of Eastern Europe are actually declining in population through internal migration. If you look at China, the big movement in China is from rural to urban. That's internal migration. Most of the increase in developing countries' city size is internal migration. It's the biggest migration in the history of the world, is migration across what you would think what used to be borders in previous configurations of countries, and yet this policy is, and if you even go down to Australia, large numbers of Australians over a period of 10 or 20 years actually go and live overseas, right? Advanced business service professional effective migration is really high as a percentage of the Australian population. So in a way, your question really touches on an important issue. Lots of Australians move between borders. You know, they're not poor people living out in country towns who can't get around. They do have education, they do have skills and so on. And so we do have a movement of people across borders with skills, just as we import people. I think Ian's fundamentally right, but there is an element of truth in cross-border movements and the resilience of countries that have actually adopted that as a migration philosophy.
Okay, next question.
Hi, I just have a problem, and I'm hoping the panel might help me. When we define who is a refugee and who is a migrant, we're talking about people who are moving to get more money, or people who are moving because they're frightened of violence from the state or their fellow men. However, I think I would rather be hit over the head and die that way than to die of starvation. And my concern is that I would be classed, if my family was starving in front of my eyes and I wanted to move countries, I would be classed as an economic migrant. And I don't think that is. And as you said earlier, with the cuts to aid to other countries, that's going to be more and more of an issue.
Okay, all right, that was a statement, not a
Tony
question.
Jones would say, I'll take
All right,
that as a comment.
next question.
Hi. So I wanted to return to an earlier point that it's not the number of people but how we live, and also to return to the question of do cities work. And I'd be interested from the panel about whether our modern cities, are they fundamentally unsustainable, and do we need to sort of cap them and try to redistribute where we live and more closely connect people with their food systems in smaller towns, and so do cities work in a sustainable sense?
Okay. We might really try and focus on the sustainability element of that, because we have answered a little bit about what actually makes a city, good big cities work. So, Michael, Ian, who would like to answer that question?
Just a couple of quick comments. One thing that's noticeable about Australia compared with most European countries is that we don't have small cities. We have 5 large cities and we have towns, and almost nothing in between, whereas in most European countries the cities of around 100,000, which are human scale and work, and it means that their food production is almost within walking distance of the market. Farmers still do pick their crops and walk into the central market. If we're serious about accommodating a larger population, and our governments seem to think that that's good, we should be thinking about planning, and the word decentralisation, which we haven't heard for about 40 years, we should really be thinking, does it make sense to double the size of Melbourne? Or in Victoria, would it make more sense to see Bendigo grow, or Ballarat grow, or Albury Wodonga grow, to have incentives for people to locate outside the large cities?
So let's assume that people aren't going to do that. Let's assume that people are still going to want to move to Melbourne. What 3 things could make Melbourne not a better city to live, we've dealt with better, but a more sustainable, self-sustaining city?
Well, in terms of sustainability, the critical thing in most cities is transport.
Right.
And Australian cities are uniquely dependent on the car.
What about these ideas about farming and such as Lenore was talking about?
Undoubtedly,
hobbies?
where many cities are bringing food production back into the city, we're still spreading our cities over productive land and planting houses which do not grow and produce fruit or vegetables on what used to be the most productive land in Victoria, in New South Wales, in Queensland and South Australia. And that's bordering on criminal neglect. Again, it's the abdication of planning and the abdication of local authorities taking responsibility for food production. So the food's coming from further away, it's transported in less sustainable ways, more people are killed and injured transporting the food to us, it costs more, and so on. If we're serious about sustainable cities, we should be thinking about what the cities need in terms of water, in terms of food, in terms of energy, and how that can be sustainably produced, rather than hoping that the next generation will be sufficiently ingenious to solve the problems we've provided them with.
Okay. Did that answer your question? Yeah? Great. Okay. Who's next? I'm going to just defer to the people with the microphones because it's easier.
I'd like to bring it back to population on a global basis. What do the panel think about the right to contraception worldwide, the right to abortion worldwide, and the right to voluntary euthanasia. 50 years ago, the average age of death in Australia was 65. Today it's 84 for women and 80 for men. Is this not a change on a global basis that we just can't, as David Suzuki has been saying for many years, we just can't keep growing because eventually you double, and it overflows?
Can I come in there on that one, please? Firstly, let me take the questions around access to family planning and abortion. And it ties in with my earlier comment about the declining birth rates in Latin America. The answer is not that alone. It's that those kinds of services have got to be embedded in viable health systems. And once you do have viable health systems, and once you have increased investment also in education systems, then you've got a demand for access to effective contraception, and there will be a lowering of the birth rate. And, you know, so it really is around paying attention to the flow of goods and to ensuring that those goods, safe contraception for men as well as women, ought to be available to everybody rather than to, in some places, the elite few.
I mean, is there anyone here who doesn't think that everyone should have a right to contraception?
One would hope not.
Or abortion?
I mean, the three things that correlate with the low birth rate are women being educated, women being in control of their fertility, and women being financially secure. And I think we'd all agree that every woman in the world should be in that position.
Just on the euthanasia question, we had quite a long discussion about that at the last question time that we had here, which was about the ageing population. So I don't want to dwell on that too much, but I mean, surely that euthanasia is not going to really make that much of a dent in the population, is it?
No, it's not, and it's certainly not going to. I mean, your starting point was around a life expectancy that's increased. Well, it's increased worldwide, and euthanasia has got nothing to do with that. And it would have to be a whole lot more like systematic murder at the age of retirement. And there are at least 3 people on this panel who are quite nervous if that's going to be suggested.
All right, we'll have a question from this side. Yep.
Yes, my question to each member of the panel is what, in your view, is the ideal population of the world? And I'd like to just phrase that in a context. If in some magical way we could wind the clock back a couple of 100 years and you were the chief global planner putting a stake in the ground to say, well, this is about where we need to head to in the greater context of the world ahead, what would that number be?
Well, Ian, I asked that of you earlier and you kind of didn't.
Well,
you dodged it.
I remember seeing a cartoon which showed a politician at the lectern saying that's a very important question which demands really sophisticated evasion.
Okay. Is anyone going to put their...
Well,
you will?
I will.
You will?
I mean, in round figures, a couple of billion people could live at our standard of living.
You mean Australian
standard of living. 7 billion people cannot. If we were going to wind the clock back and think about equitable sharing, then we would have had a global policy of aiming to stabilise the population somewhere about 2 billion. The problem with where it is now is that I think the poor people of the world are still being offered the delusion that with enough years of economic growth they can all live like Australians or Americans, and it would take 4 or 5 Earths for everyone to live like Australians or Americans. So the inevitable conclusion, I think, is that even to manage the legitimate expectations of the current world population, some of us have to live more simply so that others can simply live.
Okay.
But
I'm going to... Yeah, I'll try and ask everyone quickly because we only have 7 minutes left.
Okay.
So.
No, it's just a little footnote on that not all Australians or Americans live like us all, so that there is a local equity issue as well.
Absolutely.
I think Ian's figure's probably about right. There's a interesting literature that puts it at about that. James Lovelock famously said about 1.5 billion. He revised it up to about 2 billion later, so I think 2 billion's about right. But just to look at the scale of what that means, it took the various Homo species, of which we ended up being one, 6 million years to get to 1 billion people around 1800. It took us the last 15 years to add 1 more billion people, and we're now heading towards increasing our population by 50%. So we have to figure out how to limit the consumption. And Ian's gone into why that population is going to go up. We have to urgently figure out how to limit the consumption of that group of people, because it is also the consumption. If you look at the population, the per capita consumption rate, it was static for thousands of years, right? From the agricultural revolution till about in the industrial age, it was relatively static per capita consumption. And since 1945, it's gone viral. It's really a post-World War II problem.
Okay, Louise, this may not be your area of expertise, putting figures on this sort of thing.
No,
so.
but just I guess to echo the issue around equity and marginalisation and difference within population.
Okay, all right, let's have we'll try and get to a few quick more questions in the 5 minutes that remain.
I might be being naive, but if, as you say, the city grows and we're going to be living in, it's becoming more densely populated.
Mic a bit closer.
Sorry. I feel like we are living in closer proximity to each other, but yet we're living so apart. Do you think it's unrealistic to say that if cities were planned around a more collective style of living, that this would alleviate our pressure on resources?
Okay, so really quickly, Michael, maybe do you want to answer that question?
I mean, traditionally, that's how cities were set up. They were quite dense, low-rise, dense, very collectively organised around markets and sharing. And I guess traditionally people did share and consume less in a per capita sense. I don't know whether that's the solution. I mean, it's an interesting ideology and a philosophy of how we should live, but I think we've got to do a lot of other things than just that.
Okay, question down the back, and then I'd quite like to get some questions from up the front. There are some people who've had their hands up here.
The question I would like to put is, are people in public positions inhibited from speaking out against high immigration, even though they don't believe in high immigration, because of fear of being characterised as xenophobic or even racist?
That's a really good question. Who wants to answer that one?
Well, the short answer is yes, there's no doubt. And even when the Australian Conservation Foundation said on environmental grounds we should curb migration and we should do that in a non-discriminatory way, still people said we were being racist. And the problem is that when there are some people who do say we should curb migration for racist reasons, and so it's very difficult to avoid being tarred with that brush.
Can I make two separate points? And one is that not having migration does not resolve problems of racism, and this is a racist society. But secondly, because I also live in a society that has serious problems around xenophobia, one of the challenges around that has got nothing to do with migration again, but it's got to do with the willingness of people to discuss the underlying causes of xenophobic responses, which are within country inequalities, regardless of migration or not.
Okay. All right, we'll have one question from up the front, if you had one. This lady's had a hand up for a very long time, so let's come over here.
Thank you. I've got a question from where we sit. What can we do? And I framed my question, I said, if we were well informed about population planning problems and solutions, what would we ask of our Australian governments to prepare better for the inevitable population growth as consumers lobbying and asking for things?
Okay. It sounds like a very big question for 3 minutes left. So, okay, Lenore, go right ahead.
The Australian population needs to vote for a government that's prepared to even have this discussion.
But who is that, though?
Well, it's certainly not the one we've got now.
Well, is it anyone else, though?
No, but it is around, around community, the relationship between civil society, community discourse and engagement, and how we might shape. And we have to take, yes, indeed, responsibility for all politicians are present and their reluctance to even engage in issues around population and sustainability and the future.
Louise?
I think, Louise.
Louise.
I would say put dignity of the human person at the centre and the basis of all discussions on this matter, and increase foreign aid. It's not logical.
Increase foreign aid. Okay,
Absolutely.
rather than talking about here. Okay, all right. And one lady here finally, and then we'll have to wrap things up, I'm afraid.
You're talking about governments should help with foreign aid and all that. What about big business? No one mentioned about big business. And let's face it, big business and lobby groups who are funded by big business is now controlling governments. So what is their role in this?
Well, it's a huge role. I mean, there's a growth industry. There's a growth industry not just around population, but around investment, and it's run by the finance industry, the construction industry, the property industry, and also unions are involved in this too, construction unions in particular. So there's a vast growth industry here that's pushing a particular type of growth in, say, in a housing model, for example, that's completely inappropriate for the way most Australian people want to live. They don't want to live in, for example, the type of high-rise construction that's dominating Sydney, Brisbane and Melbourne. But that's what we're being given. It's not because people want it. It's because this vast lobby group with immense power is basically dictating to governments that this is how they must respond. And governments, I mean, a couple of years ago, the head of the Victorian Department of Premier and Cabinet said there is all this money coming in from China and America and elsewhere, and we are not in a position to refuse to accept it. Now, this was a surrendering. It was roaring up the white flag. So, yes, it's not just a matter of immigration and population increase. It is a matter of an international capitalist model that is basically meaning that we're giving over the future of our cities to international investors that have absolutely no interest in our quality of life.
Okay. Quality of life seems to be at the core of this, doesn't it? It's not just about the simple. Well, look, we have run out of time. I'm so sorry to everyone whose questions we couldn't get to. But it's such a big topic and so many things to discover. And I'll look forward to all of your letters to the editor now, saying about how we should limit population, given that seemed to be such a loudly expressed view. Thank you very much for coming along. We are going to have another question time next month, and it's going to be about the supermarket duopoly. It's already booked out, though, I'm afraid. So, as you can imagine, lots of people interested in that one. But before you all go, I'll just ask you to give one final thank you to our panellists, Louise Searle, Michael Buxton, Ian Lowe and Lenore Manderson.